Hello. This is a presentation of a substantial chunk of chapter 1, the introduction chapter that I've written for the book I'm editing called Writing Philosophical Autoethnography. It's in Forthcoming for Routledge. It should be published at the latest early 2024, but I'm hoping it's going to be published towards the end of next year, subject to us getting all the chapters in. We've got a good lineup of contributors, as well as myself. There's going to be autoethnographies from Art Bochner, Chris Poulos, Andrew Herman, Renata Ferdinand, Mena Pratt Clark, Julianne Scott Pollock, Alex Brostoff. That's the only explicitly auto theory chapter in the book. Betsy Etor, Mark Freeman, Shelley Rollins, and Georgina Tuari Stewart. So a good lineup from the States and New Zealand and here. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read out 3,000 words or so of chapter 1, and that's a chapter it's the introduction chapter. I've called it the Philosophical Autoethnographer. So here we go. Introduction. This proposed volume will constitute the first collection of narrative autoethnographic work in which authors autoethnographically explore their issues, concerns, and topics about human society, cultures, and the non-human and material worlds through an explicitly philosophical lens. In specific terms, this means that each chapter, while written as first-person autoethnography, not precluding the use of second and third-person narrative as relevant, will showcase sustained engagement with philosophical arguments, ideas, concepts, theories, and corresponding ethical positions. This philosophical basis will be fundamental to the content, topic, focus, and context of each autoethnography chapter rather than supplementary. The above is the working definition of philosophical autoethnography, which first appeared in the Routledge book proposal preceding the publication of this volume. The proposal itself emerged from an extended conversation I had with Tony Adams. At the inception of the Journal of Autoethnography in 2020, I expressed an interest as a member of the International Editorial Board in editing a special issue of the journal devoted to philosophical autoethnography. In the spring of 2021, after more discussion, Tony, co-editor of the journal, suggested I think instead about an edited volume with the same focus. I'm immensely grateful to him for planting the seed of an idea, given my long-standing concerns about narrative autoethnography and my wish for it to become more philosophically sophisticated. My beef with narrative autoethnography. Orientation is a matter of how we reside in space, shaping not only how we inhabit space, but how we apprehend this world of shared inhabitants. Ahmed, 2006. Regarding my own apprehension of the autoethnography world, I've often found myself preoccupied over the years with the meaning of narrative autoethnography. I find myself in sympathy with Craig Gingrich Philbrook's assertion that autoethnography is more a broad orientation towards scholarship than a specific procedure. I agree with this viewpoint if, at least in terms of the written mode of autoethnography, the focus of my concerns in this volume, writing is substituted for scholarship. At the risk of quoting disapproval from among my more liberal-minded autoethnographic friends, colleagues and associates, in my experience, too many unscholarly autoethnographies successfully reach the public domain. I'm uncomfortably aware that this assertion puts me at odds with the front stage image and promotion of the orientation. However, I believe that what autoethnography is supposed to be, according to contemporary definitive texts, which I think is what it should be, I've contributed to some of them, amounts to Platonization. I'll explain that in just a minute, given some autoethnographic shop floor activity. The Platonization concept best captures what I see as a troubling incoherence evident within the orientation. Autoethnography is described in definitive texts in, by default, ideal form terms. That's the Platonic reference. Given the quality of some of the work ending up as journal articles and conference presentations, I think there's an incoherence between the ideal and the actual, or some of the actual. In my view, as will hopefully become clear in this introductory chapter, this incoherence would happen less if autoethnographic writing became more philosophically rigorous. This might also result in less of a need to, arguably sometimes defensively as a form of compensatory clarification, justify autoethnography according to evocative, analytical, critical, or performative subtypes. And of course, the conceptual ladder of philosophical autoethnography could also eventually be kicked away. I'm borrowing from Wittgenstein there. You might think at this point, especially if you know me personally, that I'm simply projecting perfectionist tendencies. While I concede some truth to this, in line with my character, I regard it as a moral duty to engage in institutional critique whenever I think this is warranted. I believe that one of the costs of the autoethnographic world being too unconditionally inclusive is that its members often seem selectively blind and mute when it comes to publicly calling out unscholarly work. Denial that this happens is understandable. Criticism coming from within a family can be anathema to the extent that it breaks tacitly held loyalty rules. But meanwhile, hard-headed criticality is regularly sacrificed at the altar of what to my mind amounts to an infantilizing form of inclusivity. A striking symptom of this for me is how unscholarly work is often responded to in online and in the flesh conferences and on social media. Vacuous, happy talk superlatives of our time, brilliant, awesome, drown out critical dialogue. But you may also have spotted an irony, making the already difficult if done well autoethnographic orientation even more demanding by charging it to become more explicitly philosophical threatens inclusivity. In this regard, there are some who might feel that I'm simply advancing a version of old white male scholar normative discourse, new skin for traditional reactionary ceremony. Others might foresee a risk of autoethnography becoming a closed, unfriendly field, only available to the worthy and chosen ones. That's a quote from my friend and colleague, Trude Cleven. My response to this is that the laudable need for inclusivity, if inclusivity is understood in a grown-up rather than an infantilizing sense, doesn't preclude the need for autoethnographers to become more philosophically sophisticated. I rest this response on the assumption that autoethnographers always remain part of the broader academic scholarly community. This remains true irrespective of the inclusion of non-academics in work reaching the public domain, and the ideal of making such work accessible to wider non-specialist audiences. I should at this point stress that my implied distinction between poor and good autoethnography is gradational, not categorical. When I imagine moving along the autoethnographic texts towards the poor end of my evaluative continuum, the necessary fundamental concept, hereafter FC, of autoethnography, comprised of the auto, self, ethno, culture, cultural peoples, and graphy, analytic writing or analytic representation elements, seem to increasingly function as irrelevant ideological background. This happens in spite of laudable attempts to demarcate and celebrate autoethnography in terms of a necessary balance between these constituent elements. That the FC, the fundamental concept, the necessary fundamental concept, often seems more sleeping, perhaps comatose, than active partner, doesn't, in my experience, appear to trouble the autoethnographic community at large, at least publicly. The way I make sense of this, what might be called FC drift, is by imagining that the FC always remains safely mothballed in genre-defining autoethnographic work, functioning as a periodic, multi-directional ideological reminder to the world, to the orientations detractors, to the qualitative inquiry community in general, and to actual and potential autoethnographers, makes it a handy rhetorical resource to be pulled out whenever methodological justification is required. At my most uncharitable, I often wonder if what I see as the gap between the FC and poor practice is most evident in autoethnographies that seem to have been written the night before being uploaded onto a journal website or presented at a conference. One-shot drafts done with minimal and inadequate proofreading. In such work, I often read shallow, self-serving quirkiness substituting for depth and substance, in marked neglect of serious analysis and reflexive cultural and self-interrogation. In my view, this signals the need for better and more rigorous educational preparation, subsuming writing supervision and mentoring. Unfortunately, autoethnography is often regarded as an easy approach that can be carried off with minimal effort, background research, or thought. That this happens is understandable in the context of what Andrew Herman frames as the taming of autoethnography in the neoliberal academy. The upshot of this, at worst, is that autoethnography, as both process and product, is trivialized, or is methodologically, aesthetically, and representationally debased to the level of technical rational exercise to fit with neoliberal publication, training, audit, and ethical, as opposed to critical scholarship agendas. To combat such auto-epistemological degradation, I hold that good autoethnography demands diligence, sustained effort, and significant personal struggles on the part of its writers and readers. In this regard, I believe that greater levels of philosophical sophistication among better educated, better engaged, and more passionate autoethnographic writers would help them to both recognise the centripetal pool of neoliberal training, practice, and publication norms, and more effectively resist and work against those. To steal a maxim from Haruki Murakami, good autoethnography emerges from an act of love, not a marriage of convenience. Eschewing autoethnography on the grounds of poor scholarship relates directly to my personal impetus for editing this volume. As a very experienced autoethnographer with an academic background in theoretical and applied social science, cultural studies and the humanities, scholarly rigour and thorough preparation matter greatly to me. Equally personally important and relevant, because of my long-standing interest in the area, is my successful completion of an ME in philosophy a few years back. I undertook this degree out of a desire to add philosophical depth to my own autoethnographic writing, expressly because I thought it deficient in this regard. I also had the ambition to play some part in increasing the philosophical sophistication of the autoethnographic orientation. As a volume of work, which I hope will contribute to a palpable philosophical turn in autoethnography, this text constitutes a logical culmination of these desires. Philosophy and philosophical autoethnography. But at this point, if you're unfamiliar with philosophy, you might reasonably ask for some clarification about it and justification as to its importance and relevance for autoethnography. Nigel Warburton, in my estimation the most helpful public philosopher in the UK, whose reach extends globally, asserts that in general terms, philosophy is thinking for yourself about things that matter, especially about appearance and reality in these areas, as much as that is possible. I'd add to this definition, as an insider to the discipline, my understanding of philosophy coincides with and extends on those of a range of contemporary philosophers. For me, philosophy is always trying to better understand the nature of the narrative and cultural self in philosophical terms, the attempt to bring the highest possible degree of analytic clarity to research, the process of reflection on the deepest, most fundamental concepts used in making sense of the world, the act of being as critically reflective and as clear as possible about presuppositions, premises, concepts, claims and assumptions that people in general take for granted, the need to employ new concepts if existing ones are inadequate for the task in hand, the reflexive or second-order task of rigorously and uncompromisingly thinking about thinking, the use and development of ideas from existing philosophical work already in the public domain. In distilling the above for my own writing, my answer to the what is philosophical autoethnography question is thinking as clearly, critically, independently and deeply as I'm able to about every aspect of my autoethnographic work, and never being satisfied with how well I've done in this regard, not resting on my presuppositional and conceptual laurels, thinking as non-defensively as I possibly can about the way I think, respecting, using and developing extant philosophical work in my own writing, or thinking with philosophy. I therefore regard philosophical autoethnography as autoethnography with philosophical depth. What do I/you think about the way I/you think? This has been perhaps the most pertinent, discomfort-evoking question I've asked of myself and my colleagues, students and readers over the years. A few other related questions arise from this one, including, what do I/you feel about the way I/you think, and what led me/you to think about being, knowing, and the way the world works, and the way I/you do. I believe I'm crafting philosophical autoethnography when, to borrow from and extend on a phrase from Andrew Herman, again, I'm burrowing down as far as I can to uncover and interrogate how and what I'm writing about myself in the name of experiences I've lived through. From a philosophical perspective, this necessitates confronting what I'm taking for granted about being, or my own existence, and the existence of other human, non-human, material and cultural entities. That's ontology. Knowing and what it means to know about these existences. That's epistemology. And subsuming ontology and epistemology, what grounds my knowledge of the world and how it works in terms of what I assume to be its universal, unchanging features and principles. How did I come to acquire this knowledge, and how and in what ways might it be limited? That's metaphysics. Therefore, the crucial overarching metaphysical question for me in this regard is, what are my assumptions about how the world works, specifically related to being in and knowing about it, and how might these assumptions be flawed? The case for and against making autoethnography more philosophically sophisticated. With my metaphysical question in mind, I find the idea of plotting all narrative autoethnographic texts in the public domain on a continuum from weak to strong sense philosophical autoethnography to be a productive thought experiment. Every autoethnographic piece on this continuum will be minimally philosophical to the extent that each inevitably proceeds from more or less explicitly held metaphysical and onto epistemological root metaphor standpoint positions. To put this another way, every autoethnographic text will be minimally philosophical in containing displayed assumptions, presuppositions, and concepts relating to how the world works and what counts as being in it and knowing about it. I see weak sense philosophical synonymous with poor and with minimally philosophical autoethnographies, displaying discursively restricted, culturally normative, and conventional assumptions, presuppositions, and concepts used in uncritical, unclear, confused, incoherent, and sometimes contradictory ways. I see strong sense philosophical conflated with good autoethnographies doing the opposite. At this point, you might take issue with my weak to strong sense idea. You may think that my need to make autoethnography more explicitly philosophical is based on a straw man argument on the grounds that by my own lights, narrative autoethnography is always already minimally philosophical. If your objection is reasonable, then my express need to make autoethnography more strong sense philosophical might amount to no more than a methodologically and conceptually irrelevant gripe. My response to you is that minimally philosophical doesn't imply sufficiently philosophical. To stretch a point here, everything written by any human is minimally philosophical, but not every human is epistemically and reflexively aware of this. I hold by my contention that in becoming more explicitly philosophical in terms of the level of rigor and clarity described above, autoethnographers will be in a better position to raise their autoethnographic game. In specific terms, they will ideally be in a position to increase their discursive, subsuming conceptual, interpretive, and analytic range and sophistication. Discursive here refers to the ability to access, use, and socially transmit language in ways that can make a difference to how people comprehend their worlds and act in and on them. Minimally philosophical autoethnography is, by definition, likely to be discursively deprived. The second point is they will deepen and enrich their critically reflexive second order thinking abilities by working against habitual tendencies to respond to themselves, others, and the world in incurious, unquestioning ways. They will combat their naive realism, or the tendency to tacitly assume that how the world is perceived through their senses is how the world actually is for themselves and for others. They'll be wary of being seduced into meme fetishism. Cutting the cloth of conceptual thinking to meet this year's fashion amounts to the tendency to repeatedly treat as timeless cultural concepts and ideas that may turn out to have been evanescent or ephemeral. They will challenge their received, insufficiently scrutinized assumptions about self and culture. They will subject their ideological beliefs about how the world works, the metaphysical beliefs in other words, including the ideological basis of autoethnography, to critical scrutiny. I define ideology, ideological in this context after the philosopher Sally Haslanger, as habits of thought, unconscious patterns of response, and inarticulate background assumptions that we assimilate and enact in order to navigate our social world. They will manage equivocation and question begging. In the context of philosophy, equivocation refers to the phenomenon of concepts left vaguely or inadequately defined and or treated in confused and contradictory ways in a single piece of work. So concepts that mean different things at different points in a single piece of work. Question begging, sometimes called arguing in a circle, occurs when an argument's premises assume the truth of its conclusion instead of supporting or proving it. They will deliberately and selectively engage theories and concepts from a variety of philosophical perspectives in considering, questioning, and developing integrative, but often necessarily unresolved, narrative and dialogical perspectives on lived experiences. But how philosophically credentialed and informed does an autoethnographer need to be? At this point in the chapter, your response to my developing position might be, with your postgraduate education in philosophy, Alec, it's easy for you to pontificate. Point taken. But I should stress that I'm never satisfied with how well I write philosophical autoethnography. This chapter, and indeed the entire volume, is to my mind aspirational work in progress. Sierra Ahmed writes, I write this book as someone who does not reside within philosophy. It's a risk to read philosophy as a non-philosopher. When we don't have the resources to read certain texts, we risk getting things wrong by not returning them to the fullness of their intellectual histories from which they emerge. And yet, we read. The promise of interdisciplinary scholarship is that the failure to return texts to their histories will do something. I read Ahmed's words, will do something, as signalling the benefits of creative failure. Creative failure is a vital concept. You don't have to self-identify as a philosopher to add philosophical depth to your autoethnographic work. Nor do you have to reach an ideal pinnacle of philosophical autoethnographic expertise, whatever that might be. Aspiring to philosophical depth will, I believe, enable you to enhance your abilities to work creatively with new ideas and perspectives, and address established topics in fresh ways from a broader discursive platform. Despite my master's degree in the subject, to some extent, like Ahmed, I don't consider that I reside comfortably and exclusively within philosophy. My writing home is autoethnography, and my primary allegiance is to that orientation. Thank you.